All right. I'm gonna wait for Carl to come back. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to PMP Live. Thank you so much for joining us in this new format where we can continue to bring authors and their new books to the politics and prose community. And as this is still a new format for us, please bear with us as we work out the kinks and get comfortable. At any point, anytime during this event, you can click on the green button below that says purchase The Life of William Faulkner, and that will take you directly to the Politics and Prose website. So please do that. We're currently offering free media mail shipping on all orders over the website or through the phone, and as well as curbside pickup. And every purchase goes to support our small business at a time when we truly need it the most. You're still able to ask Carl questions tonight or today. Just on the little button below, it says ask a question. If you're on your phone, you'll see the chat disabled thing. You can press the plus sign, and that is also ask a question. And then when you click in there, you can see that there's an up arrow. You can choose to click up and like the questions that you want to hear the most. Also know that the author and myself and everyone else out there cannot see you, so just feel free to be as you are. And then finally, we want to thank you so much for being here with us today. It's small businesses like Politics and Prose that especially need your support at times like this. And so, without further ado, we are very pleased to welcome Carl Rollyson to PMP Live, celebrating his newest work, The Life of William Faulkner. The Past is Never Dead, 1897 to 1934. Carl is a professor emeritus of journalism at Baruch College, the City University of New York, and the author of more than 40 books, ranging in subject matter from biographies such as Marilyn Monroe, Susan Sontag, Norman Mailer, and an upcoming one on Sylvia Plath, and to studies of American culture, genealogy, children's biography, film, and literary criticism. He's authored more than 500 articles on American and European literature and history, and his work has been reviewed in newspapers such as New York Times, the Washington Post, Sunday Telegraph, among many others. And so please now join me in welcoming Carl Rollyson to PMP Live.
It's a pleasure to be here. I feel this is sort of like a fireside chat in a way, since it's taking place in my home as well as in your home, wherever you are. I really wanted to appear live and in person, but everyone knows why that's not possible for you or for me. So I'm delighted to have this opportunity and to reach a lot of people this way, I think. Let me give you a little bit of background about the book. In one way, this book has been about 50 years in the making. We can go back all the way to the late 1960s when I was in college reading William Faulkner and becoming intrigued with him, on to graduate school and doing a dissertation on Faulkner, which I completed in 1975 and then published as a revised book in 1984. I view him as a great world author. Didn't know until maybe 6-7 years ago that I would do a biography of him. I had done a number of biographies of literary figures and journalists and even political figures, and Faulkner certainly was always a candidate, but there are a lot of Faulkner biographies, and so anyone who is going to dare to write yet another biography of William Faulkner certainly has to ask himself or herself why. In my case, there were a number of reasons. You might almost say it was over-determined in a way. I have spent a good deal of my time in Hollywood working on figures like Dana Andrews and Marilyn Monroe and Walter Brennan, writing biographies of them. And it occurred to me about 7, 8 years ago when I was reviewing another Faulkner biography, that even with all the books on Faulkner, certainly all the biographies, not much attention was paid to his screenwriting. I think in part because he himself discounted it. He would say, well, I never really learned the medium, or I was a motion picture doctor, I worked on bits and pieces. He could never feel it was really his medium, the way he felt that the novel or the short story was. But I wondered about that. In my experience as a biographer, one of the things that I have found out about my subjects is that they don't necessarily know parts of themselves as well as other people know them. Or to put it in another way, I can't walk around myself. I can't have a 360-degree view of myself. And there are things I'm sure about myself that I don't know or don't appreciate that other people could tell me, probably won't to my face, but could if they were doing biographies of me, which of course they won't. And so I got very curious because I knew Faulkner had spent a lot of time in Hollywood. He had spent the equivalent of 4 years there, not continuously, but off and on over more than a 20-year period. And given a man of his imagination and his power, and the fact that his name was attached to some great films like To Have and Have Not and The Big Sleep, I really wondered about that. And so I began to look at not the biographies, but the literary scholarship of the last 20 years, which indeed started to explore many aspects of Faulkner's career in Hollywood. So what I've done in my biography is, to use an academic term, I've written what you might call an intertextual biography. And by that I mean, I will discuss, let's say, one of his novels, The Wild Palms, or the title he preferred, If I Forget Thee, Jerusalem. And I discussed that novel in the context of what he was writing in Hollywood, for a motion picture studio, at virtually the same time. In this case, that film was Drums Along the Mohawk. And I show, in fact, there are even lines from the movie script that bleed into the novel, so to speak. So there's this mutuality, there's this influence, and that really becomes one of the focal points of the second volume of my biography. But even in the first volume, by the time you get to the 1930s, he's working on a film with Howard Hawks, an adaptation of a novel, Sutter's Gold. If you know William Faulkner at all, and you know his great novel, Absalom, Absalom, the key figure in that novel is Thomas Sutpen. Well, Sutpen, Sutter, that's not a coincidence. Many things about Sutter and the California Gold Rush, this titanic individual, it becomes the focal point of both Faulkner's novel and his movie script. And the wonderful thing about the Sutter's Gold movie script, which has never been published, but is in Howard Hawks' papers, is that you see the influence of silent film on Faulkner, the way he had a visual imagination. Many people say Faulkner couldn't write movie dialogue. Well, in Sutter's Gold, he didn't really have to write movie dialogue, given the way the movie begins with the focus on gold and a bank and the exchange of money. Now, why did Faulkner do it that way? He was actually rewriting a screenplay by Eisenstein, who also was brought to Hollywood to work on Sutter's Gold. When Faulkner rewrote it, he brought in his own experiences. What experiences? He worked in his grandfather's bank. And you have this sense of money changing hands and what it means in a materialistic culture when you have this gold rush. So that gives you some idea of how there's a kind of interplay that goes on in my biography. What I'm trying to say is Faulkner was a writer who's working on many different levels. After all, this is a man who wrote for the Saturday Evening Post, even for Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, as well as writing these great novels like The Sound of Fury and Light in August. So that's one reason I really wanted to do another biography, because when you read the other Faulkner biographies, and some of them are very good, but when they talk about the movies, it's sort of like Meanwhile Back at the Ranch. That is, the real work is the novels. The film scripts really don't count. And I look upon this very differently. What you get is a whole life of a writer in my book. in a very different way than in the previous Faulkner biographies. Matthew Buckley, many years ago, was asked, "Why are you writing another biography of F. Scott Fitzgerald?" Buckley said, "More facts, new facts." Well, that's true with Faulkner too. One of the things I should mention that my book is indebted to is the work of a Faulkner scholar who was a biographer. That is, he was working on a biography. His name is Carvel Collins. Carvel Collins began his biography of William Faulkner in 1948, and he was still working on it in 1990 when he died. He never wrote a word. Not a word. I can't find anything in his papers. 105 boxes at the University of Texas. But in those same boxes are dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews that he did between 1948 and 1990. And these have never been used by other biographers. He spoke with Faulkner's mother. He spoke with Faulkner. He spoke with Faulkner's brother. Faulkner left to stay at the Algonquin Hotel in New York. Well, Carvel Collins went down to the Algonquin and he interviewed everybody that ever had anything to do with William Faulkner at the Algonquin. So he was a real pack rat. His work, all of these interviews, just provide a tremendous texture to my book that I think is new in Faulkner. You get a sense of the man. You get a kind of intimacy. And while I'm talking about intimacy, I should say what you'll learn in this biography is a great deal about Faulkner, frankly, in his love life, because he was a very passionate man. I think it had to be a passionate man to write the novels that he did. And Carvel Collins got to know one of his lovers, Meade Carpenter, very well, and did extensive interviews with her. She was really a remarkable subject and verifiable. One of the things she did is deposited his drawings, his pornographic drawings of her in the New York Public Library, which I'm the first biographer, not the first one to know about it, but the first one to really use them and to talk about them and what they reveal about Faulkner, both as a man, as an artist. He loved to draw. And some of his very early work, which I include in the first volume of my biography, is of his drawing. His one is influenced by Aubrey Beardsley, for example. Very interesting drawing. So there's new facts. What else? Well, there are figures in the life of William Faulkner who haven't been given their due, so to speak. One of them is his wife, Estelle. She certainly appears in the other Faulkner biographies, but unfortunately, she is so subsidiary. You don't ever really understand, well, why exactly did he marry her? I think you learn about that because one of the things that you'll read in my biography are excerpts from her letters, what her view of things was, her view of the marriage. And also she had 2 children by a first marriage. And what you get is what kind of a father Faulkner was. He didn't have children of his own, but he was a wonderful stepfather. And there's his stepson Malcolm's letters and diaries and journal that I deal with, so that you get, again, a very well-rounded sense of who William Faulkner was. There are other figures that don't appear at all in previous Faulkner biographies. A lawyer, Hubert Starr, who first met Faulkner in New Haven in 1918. Faulkner was just really a young kid, Billy Faulkner, who was tagging along with his friend Phil Stone, who was getting a law degree from Yale. And Faulkner's experiences at Yale, what he learned in a college dormitory, well, again, if you're a reader of Faulkner and you know Absalom, part of which occurs in a Harvard, not a Yale dormitory, you understand how seminal the period in 1918 was. Hubert Starr later became Faulkner's attorney in California, when at one point, during a crisis in the Faulkner marriage, Faulkner called on Hubert Starr to represent him in the divorce case. Eventually, the divorce case was dropped mutually by Faulkner and his wife, but those incidents and periods are a very important part of the Faulkner biography. The other thing you have to reckon with in dealing with Faulkner is the first biography, Joseph Blattner, who also wrote 2 volumes and who we're all in his debt. because he interviewed a great many people, some of the people Carvel Collins interviewed, but others as well. And he documented, really gave you a factual basis for Faulkner's life that you simply can't ignore. The historian Herbert Butterfield said the first biography always maps out the territory. Of course, the first biographer makes mistakes. The first biographer omits things for a variety of reasons, often because there are living figures in the family who don't want certain things said. And this is true with Joseph Buckner. It's one of the things I found when I looked at Buckner's papers. Fortunately, Buckner left his papers for us to examine. And one of the things I found in the papers was a statement by Jill Faulkner, Faulkner's daughter, his only daughter, in which she said she was thanking Joseph Buckner. She said, because he told hundreds of little white lies. In other words, there are biographers who reveal, and there are also biographers who conceal. And Buckner did a good deal of both. We're really in his debt, but there are things that when you're a subsequent biographer like me, you wonder, you want to know things that Buckner can't tell you or didn't want to talk about. Again, going back to Faulkner's wife, Estelle, Buckner was very careful with Estelle. She was cooperative, but he treated her like a Southern lady, and there were things he just couldn't bring himself to ask her. That I am not a Southern gentleman. I'm a modern contemporary biographer. I certainly would have asked her. So there are things that I have to speculate on, things that I have to look at again in terms of her letters. She was a very lively, effervescent personality. And I think when you read some of the things that she wrote, you'll begin to see why Faulkner was attracted to her and why she was important to him and so loyal to him, even when on several occasions he wasn't loyal to her. So I think that's very important. I was lucky to be able to interview people still alive who knew Faulkner. There aren't that many because Faulkner died in 1962, but there were children and young adults who lived close to the Faulkner home, Roanoke, who I was able to interview and told me wonderful things. For example, about Estelle herself. You would never guess, really, from reading other biographies of Faulkner that Estelle was an artist. She was quite a good painter. And in fact, in their home at Roanoke, she had an easel in her bedroom that she used to work at quite assiduously. And in fact, after Faulkner died, she had an exhibition of her paintings, which are quite good, quite fascinating, wonderful sense of color. So there were things I could learn about Estelle, about the way she played the piano, the way she entertained. There's a sense of Faulkner in my book, I think, as a family man that you won't find elsewhere. He loved to dress up for dinner. He loved to ensure that there were correct manners. Nobody sat down until Estelle sat down. Faulkner served. Anyone who came to the table who wanted to smoke was not served wine. Their wine glass was turned upside down because Faulkner believed that smoking interfered with eating. He was a wine connoisseur. There are things in my book about his affection and interest in fine wine, fine tobacco, smoking a pipe, very contemplative kind of man who drew a sharp distinction from his father, who loved cigars and who wasn't a literary type. And Faulkner very much, as growing up in a small town in Mississippi, wanted to distinguish himself. And that cane, the cane when he came back from service in Toronto, but also the pipe became a kind of prop, almost a Sherlock Holmes kind of prop that he would use sometimes even when telling stories to children. And his love of children, which comes out in his fiction, is also very much the case in his own life. Very fond of his niece Dean, who wrote a memoir about him and reveals certain things about the family. Oh, there's one other thing I think I should talk about that relates to politics and prose in particular, to the bookstore's interest, to some of its speakers. People usually don't think of Faulkner as a political writer. He didn't join political parties, really. In fact, there's a scene in my book with Dashiell Hammett and Lillian Hellman, very radical leftists, and of Hammett berating Faulkner, and Faulkner very calmly taking in, absorbing Hammett's lecture. He was very fond of Hammett and not taking offense at all at Hammett's politics, although they weren't Faulkner's politics. He was quite conservative in some ways, even anti-New Deal, named one of his mules Eleanor Roosevelt. But Faulkner had a powerful, very powerful understanding of fascism, which I think is particularly relevant to today, and certainly to 20th century history, but especially to today. Now, where did this understanding of fascism come from? Well, there was certainly an element of fascism in his own hometown. The lynchings that went on, which I describe in some vivid detail. But something else happened to Faulkner in 1925. This is just as he was beginning to write fiction. He had thought of himself early on as a poet and came to fiction only 5, 6, 7 years after a great deal of writing of poetry. He took a Wanderjahr, he took a European trip in 1925, 6 months abroad in Italy and France, and spent a little bit of time in England as well, and some other countries, Switzerland. But it was his time in Mussolini's Italy that made the difference. There's a short story of his called Mistral, which he probably, we don't know for sure, but he probably wrote in maybe 1925, 26, shortly after he came home from Italy. Mistral, I won't go through a plot summary. I just will tell you that there's a death that occurs in this small Italian mountain village. It's probably a murder. There are 2 young Americans who are visiting, and they become aware that there's something wrong here, something that's being covered up. And they're so careful, seeing how the Italian inhabitants are so guarded, so secretive, that when they refer to this murder, they say things like, "I love Mussolini, no spica." And the no spica, of course, refers to when they've tried to engage Italians and they don't speak English and they say no spica. But it becomes a kind of code word in Mistral for the fact that there are events that have occurred. Probably the murder of a young man, a young suitor, a priest is involved, and they're trying to figure this out. And they don't figure it out because the point of the story is so much is suppressed and people are so fearful that they simply can't level with. They can't tell these young men what happened. And in some cases, they probably don't know exactly what happened. Well, I relate this to a lynching that occurred in 1909 when Faulkner was just a boy, of a man named Nels Patton, who's described as this deranged Negro who slits a white woman's throat. Well, in fact, Nels Patton was a bootlegger that everybody knew. He sold the black and white alike. And what exactly happened during that, I speculate and I try to explain what I think happened between Nels Patton and this white woman. But the point is, nobody could ever speak openly about it. And so you could see there's a parallel here between Faulkner's short story and what happens in Italy in 1925. And this is not an isolated incident. This thinking about fascism and what it means to live in a fascist society, because of course, Light in August in many ways is about what it means to live in a fascist society. In fact, Faulkner said he created a character, Percy Grimm, who was a Nazi before Faulkner knew what Nazis really were. In other words, the novel was published in 1932. Hitler came to power in 1933. What does Percy Grimm do? He's kind of like one of these right-wing reactionary militiamen. And he wants to prove his white superiority by going after Joe Christmas, who's again assaulted, taken a razor to a white woman's neck, to Joanna Burden's neck. So that Nelspat lynching, the Italian story in 1925, this idea of organizing a community, working up their feelings about race, very much comes to the fore. But Faulkner's not done. As you'll see in the second volume, he comes back to this whole issue of fascism when he publishes the third volume of the Snopes trilogy, The Mansion, in which he has a character, Linda Snopes, who is an anti-fascist and who has come back from Spain, having been deafened by an explosion during the Spanish Civil War. And she goes about trying to educate the Black population. Very interesting political novel. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is very little has been made of it. I've read, probably 24 interpretations of Faulkner's 1925 story, Mistral. No one even mentions Mussolini. No one even mentions what the subtext of the story is. One other thing, which brings me back to Hollywood. Faulkner wrote a story, a screenplay story called Mythical Latin American Kingdom Story. This was the last treatment he did when he was working for MGM in 1932. This is about a woman named Maria Rojas, who engineers a revolution in a country which is something like Cuba. And it also obviously is influenced by Joseph Conrad and his great novel Nostromo, which is also about a South American revolution. What's fascinating about this is, again, that it deals with fascism, but it also deals with a woman who's a very powerful central figure. So I put it to you this way. Suppose before my biography, we had books which were intertextual, that integrated Faulkner's work in Hollywood, because what he did in Hollywood allowed him actually to introduce certain elements, including politics, that are either a subtext of his novels or are not, for one reason or another, in his novels at all. But because of the nature of the screenplays he was either given to work on or that he initiated, Latin American Kingdom Story is a completely original piece of his that the studio did not produce. We don't know exactly why, but it's not unusual for screenwriters to write a good deal of stuff which doesn't get produced because it's either too expensive or is politically incorrect or in some way or other is offensive to what was then called the production code. So what's interesting to me about Faulkner is, on the one hand, you have this great novelist, this great writer, who, when he sits down at his writing table in Mississippi, feels absolutely free to do what he wants. He does face certain censorship. There's certain words he can't use that he writes in his manuscripts that his publishers censor, having to do with sexuality, including lesbianism. So there are some constraints there on writers, a writer like Faulkner, but the production code after 1933-34 is a much more stronger restriction, and yet he's pushing the boundaries. He's writing about things including rape and Drums Along the Mohawk, which didn't get into the picture for obvious reasons. He's really testing the limits of the medium as a screenwriter in a way that if you read every single interview of Faulkner, you'd have no idea that that's what he was up to. And that's what my biography is, a kind of additional text, supplementary text, a way of understanding his life that you can't get from the subject himself or herself. And perhaps I'll stop there and we could turn it over to questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I want to remind everybody that as we go into the Q&A, that you can upvote your favorite questions and send that to the top, and those are the ones that I'm gonna be asking. Looks like one of our viewers, it goes by Territorial, asks, what do you think Faulkner would have to say about the situation today?
Of course, no one knows what Faulkner would have said. I don't think he would have been entirely surprised to see a society which is unprepared for a pandemic. I think the nature of his work is about getting ready for the future, and that we're not ready for the future. Now, why do I say that? What evidence do I have for that? You're going to have to wait to some extent for volume 2, which is going to appear in September, which goes from 1935 to his death in 1962. There's a line in his great novel, Absalom, Absalom, in which Shreve, who's talking to his college roommate, Quentin, they've been putting together this story of Thomas Sutpen, and Quentin is obviously very upset about this story and about the implications of the story. It has to do with miscegenation and murder. And Shreve, who's a Canadian, asks Quentin quite bluntly, why you hate the South? And Quentin says, I don't hate it, I don't hate it. And Shreve also says at the very end of the novel, I who regard you now will have descended from the loins of African kings. That's a stupendous, incredible statement for someone to be writing in 1936, almost as if you were on some kind of anthropological journey, discovery, about the origins of mankind. He's saying to Quentin, get out of your provinciality, look around you, look at what's happening to you. This is a much bigger story than your genealogy in the South and what happened to the Southern characters in this story. We're talking about a much, much bigger story. I think in that sense, Faulkner knew. I know from his talks in the 1950s, he was talking about overpopulation. He was talking about a world in which the white race are the minority race, and we better get prepared for that. So I think he would have had a lot to say about what's happening right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then Wes asks, did Faulkner consider himself a modernist?
Faulkner certainly did consider himself a modernist. In fact, I think because he viewed the novel as his primary medium, what he was born to do, although he didn't know that to begin with, he thought he was born to be a poet. But he concluded that the novel was his medium, and I think he was very much a part of that modernist generation. I mean, he revered people like T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, and he saw himself in that sort of elite category of writer. But what interests me about him, he did see himself as a modernist, and I don't think he fully appreciated the level of his accomplishment as a popular writer, a Saturday Evening Post writer, but also a screenwriter in Hollywood. Perhaps because he knew his fellow artists also, especially at that time, didn't have much respect for screenwriting. And of course, he did do it for the money, but we all do lots of things for money. It doesn't mean that we don't have other motivations as well. And so I think, yeah, absolutely, he thought of himself as a modernist.
Thank you. Then Scott asks, what were the origins of Faulkner's dense prose style?
I think that dense prose style surprised him as well. I think part of what's happening is I think Faulkner really was a genius. And I think there are so many things occurring to him at one time that the complexity of the prose, and not all of his prose is complex. He's written some very straightforward prose as well. But some of his most profound novels, certainly Absalom, Absalom, for example, or The Sound of Fury, the prose is, I have to say, very dense and certainly has to be read more than once to be understood by most people. I think it's because of his sense of time, which he once admitted was Bergsonian time, by which he meant the French philosopher, and the notion that, in a sense, all time is occurring at once, that every single moment has within it both its past and its future. And Faulkner said his characters, the characters he's writing about, they're in that moment of time, but that time that they're in is leading to another time, and it's also the summation of the time that's gone before. So if you have that notion of time, people often say Faulkner's fixated on the past. Well, he is and he isn't. he's not fixated on the past as a separate category. He's fixated on the past as a continuum of time, so that when one of his characters says the past is never dead, to quote the subtitle of my biography, the past is never dead, not because it's fixed, but because in a sense it's still occurring. And what we think of the past depends very much on what we're doing right now.
Yeah. All right. And then Roxanne asks, do students today react to Faulkner differently than students maybe 10 years ago?
I think it depends on the students and what kind of background the students have. I have taught Faulkner. Sometimes it's gone well, sometimes not so well. Sometimes students complain about the difficulty of it. I've taught Absalom, which maybe is his most difficult novel. And when students complain about it, I often, believe it or not, send them to the reader responses on Amazon, where all kinds of readers are praising this novel to the skies. What I'm trying to show them is, again, you have to, in a sense, get outside of yourself, which is what Faulkner wants you to do. So I think that's part of it. You know, Faulkner he never really taught classes, but he parked himself in a class at the University of Virginia. He also did this at the University of Mississippi, and he did it at Princeton. And he would respond to students' questions. One question would be, you know, I read The Sound of Fury and I don't understand it, Mr. Faulkner. And Faulkner's answer would be, read it again. That there's no way to fully explain a complex work of literature. You have to go and really confront it yourself. One time he got very impatient with a Princeton student, and he actually said, I don't think literature was made for Princeton students.
All right. So Bob asks, what book or story do you think is most underestimated?
Well, one of my big surprises, people often ask a biography, anything surprise you? And this is not so much about the man, although I do have an autobiographical reading of this. There's a novella called Knight's Gambit, and it was published in 1949, a part of a collection called Knight's Gambit. But there's a separate novella, Knight's Gambit, which I just think is a beautiful work of art. And the other stories don't come up to its level, I don't think, in it. They were written as what used to be called pot boilers. Faulkner was very, very fond of detective fiction. That's what he read for leisure. He loved those cheap 25-cent paperbacks in his time, and he would read them all. And he thought doing mysteries was just great. Knight's Gambit is about the main character is Gavin Stevens, a character he often uses. And it's about Gavin Stevens. He's almost like Edgar Allan Poe's Auguste Dupin in his ability to think out things. He's a Platonist. You know, he can get the idea of things without, like Aristotle, studying a number of different instances of it. So Knight's Gambit is about how Gavin Stevens is able to do this, to sit in his room and yet understand what's happening outside in his community. And I think that's just a wonderful piece by Faulkner, and don't understand why that has not been more greatly valued.
Kind of as a follow-up to that, I'm curious, people ask, you know, what your favorite work is, but I'm more curious, which one have you returned to the most or read the most amount of times?
It's been Absalom, because that was the key novel in my dissertation, and that's really the to me that's as great as anything that was written in the 20th century. To me, it's not only a 20th century book; it's a 21st century book. I think the way he deals with race in that novel, the way he creates a character, Charles Bond, who I'm coming out with an article in the Hedgehog Review called Faulkner as Futurist, or how he predicted the election of Barack Obama. Charles Bond is a Barack Obama figure in that novel, and I'll just leave people with that intriguing thought.
Awesome. Where are you, mouse? One second. So, what was the as you were digging? What was the most interesting new fact that you discovered, and kind of like like what surprised you the most?
I think the degree to which Faulkner was able to keep what he told his mother were trade secrets. How even in all the interviews he's given and so on, there was a part of him that he simply would not disclose. And I have a passage in my biography dealing with that, in which I say, I think Faulkner felt that somehow he would use up some aspect of his creativity if he actually leveled with readers outside of the covers of his books. He's very cagey. He does tell you things, and sometimes very important things. But for a biographer, in a way, it was wonderful. You would think it'd be frustrating, but for me, it was so tantalizing to think about what was he really doing in certain situations. I give you an early example when he went to Hollywood, and he had not done really any work as a screenwriter, and he got there on the fame of Sanctuary, his notorious novel. And he says to the story editor at MGM, gee, I'd love to write a piece, I'd love to do a Mickey Mouse cartoon. And this story editor says, well, this is MGM, this is not Walt Disney, we can't do Mickey Mouse. And sometimes people have taken that as just how ignorant Faulkner was about Hollywood. I think, number one, he may have been pulling a leg there. Second, he really was interested in Mickey Mouse. He loved cartoons. He loved to draw cartoons. So that was really, one of the things I felt about Faulkner is that I have to look very carefully at what he says, because he may be joking, but he may be actually telling you something important.
Yeah. And then Claire asks, is there a character whose life resembles Faulkner's, or did Faulkner identify with any of his characters? And do you identify with any of his characters, with the man himself?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think you can find a character in the novels who represents Faulkner. He actually refers to himself in his second novel, Mosquitoes, as a little dark man, which is very interesting. I make a lot of that in my book. But other than that self-reference there, generally, a lot of his experiences, things he experienced, are in his novels, but there isn't a character like him. Often in the later fiction, his character Gavin Stevens, even a sophisticated critic like Edmund Wilson, treated Gavin Stevens as Faulkner's mouthpiece. And I think that's mistaken. Faulkner himself said that Gavin Stevens was kind of a Southern liberal of his time. And while Faulkner was liberal on some aspects, he would certainly not have described himself as a Southern liberal. So what we get in my biography of Faulkner is a real sort of spreading out of its experience into all these different characters, but no character, so far as I can see, is really Faulkner. And in fact, there are various models for characters, like the Gavin Stevens character is something like his friend Phil Stone, but there are so many differences as well. That's one of the things Faulkner, that's why Faulkner stayed away from historical fiction, he said, because he said, I can do better than God. He said, I don't want to deal with, say, Huey Long in Louisiana and Colin Williams, Willie Stark, the way that Robert Penn Warren does, because people start comparing that character to the real life model. Whereas, for me, I want everything to be original.
And then Abby says, did William Faulkner look back on the story of Temple Drake and other novels and realize how timeless the books were, although some of the film treatments, such as the second film of that novel, was so unlike the book?
Yeah, he had an interesting attitude toward adaptations of his own novels. He felt the novels had their own independent existence, And if anyone wanted to pay him to film a novel, he was going to take that money, whether what the outcome was good or not. Now, he thought the outcome of Intruder in Dust was wonderful. I think he liked aspects even of the first Sanctuary movie, the story of Temple Drake. He loved the way that they shot the rape scene in it. He thought that was really important. So I think that, and sometimes he was asked later after he won the Nobel Prize to adapt his own work, and he had no interest in doing that. And yet, Douglas Sirk did a film called Tarnished Angels, which is a adaptation of Faulkner's novel Pylon, which Faulkner liked. Actually said in an interview, I like that a lot. He said, I'm not sure how much it has to do with my novel, but I think it's a good film. Actually, Faulkner had no compunctions about that, about changing things. Mm. Some of his early treatments, he uses his fictional characters like the Sartorus brothers, and he gives them completely different stories. And that doesn't bother him at all. In other words, he didn't, because he had written a certain way about them in a novel, didn't mean he could change the whole thing around in a screenplay. Didn't bother him at all.
Nice. Which of his novels, Chris asks, which of his novels was Faulkner most proud of, and why do you believe?
He most often mentioned The Sound and the Fury in a curious way. He called it his most splendid failure, that he tried. There are 4 sections of the novel, and each time he tried to tell the story in a different way. But I think that's the one, that's his 4th novel, and I think it's his first great novel. And I think that's when he discovered, his full powers. So I think that was really the novel that I was worried when I got to that point in writing the biography that I would do justice to The Sound and the Fury, because I knew how much that novel meant to Faulkner and how it propelled him into a lot of his other great work.
Yeah. Topic of religion. Did he have or question a belief?
He seems to have believed in God. He invokes God a lot, especially in his nonfiction speeches and so on. And he took issue with the existentialists, their atheism. He certainly didn't endorse that. But he wasn't a regular churchgoer. He went to church at times. He certainly believed, as I say, in the deity. I think he felt that sense of a higher power was important for humanity, and he often talked about that. He wrote a very interesting short piece about Ernest Hemingway and the Old Man of the Sea. It's almost as if he was saying Hemingway had discovered God, that there was something, there was a kind of awe he found in that particular piece by Hemingway that he particularly liked.
And then, and Bob asks, why was he so interested in incest?
Was he so interested in incest? It certainly occurs in a novel like The Sound and the Fury. You don't see it so much, I don't think, in the later work, unless I'm missing something. I think it has to do, the incest has a lot to do in The Sound of the Fury with the sort of ingrown family of the Compsons, of their inability to deal with the world outside of themselves. Quentin Compson wants to put his sister Caddy on a pedestal, and partly his suicide has a lot to do with the fact that it is an imperfect world and Caddy is an imperfect vessel. And that you can't hold it that close to home, so to speak, that you have to open up yourself to the world. And I think incest is just the opposite, isn't it? It's a closing down, it's a retreat, it's a withdrawal, it's into a kind of subjectivity that Quentin suffers from.
And then Wes asks, you wrote a book about Amy Lowell as well, since Faulkner wanted to be a poet and saw himself as a a Pound or an Eliot, what do you think he thought of Amy Lowell's poetry?
It's funny. I mentioned Amy Lowell in the first volume of the biography, partly because of my own interest in Lowell and the fact that I've written a biography of Amy Lowell. I think he was influenced by Amy Lowell and what was called the Images School. I think if you look at The Sound and the Fury, particularly the Benjy section, the way Benjy describes them hitting the ball, the way the vivid concrete images there are very much the way maybe an imagist would do it. There's an early piece of prose by Faulkner when he wrote when he was, before he'd written any of his novels yet, in which he makes a kind of disparaging comment about Amy Lowell, very much as Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot disparaged Lowell as well, that she just kind of like a saleswoman for poetry, he sort of mouthed, really repeated that kind of slur. And yet I think when I look at his work itself, particularly, and this we get to in the second volume, Absalom, and those scenes when Charles Bond and Judith Sutton are walking in a garden remind me very much of Amy Lowell's poem Patterns. So I think there is at least a kind of subterranean Lowell influence.
Nice. So then Chris asks, generally, what effect did World War I have on Faulkner and his writing?
Tremendous impact. World War I had a tremendous impact on Faulkner and his writing. He wanted to go and fight. He was born in 1897, so he was old enough to go and fight the war. And I didn't know this until I started doing the biography, when I found a letter in which his mother had actually forbidden him to do what Dos Passos had done and Hemingway had done, which was to go join the ambulance corps before the U.S. got into the war. She said, no, you're too young for that, and I couldn't bear to lose you. And he was, I mean, this is a whole other topic, he was a mama's boy. He stayed home. Ultimately, it's a little murky as to why this happened. He was only 5'5", and it's been said that he was too small, too slight for American forces. There's no evidence that the American forces would really have rejected him for those reasons. He ended up in Toronto, in Canada, pretending to be an Englishman, and he joined the RAF and trained as a pilot, doing these meticulous drawings of airplanes, but never got off the ground because the war ended. And so he was furloughed, he went home, and he pretended that he had been in France. He pretended that he had a war wound, that he had a limp, he had a cane, and the RAF uniform had a sort of designation that suggested that he had been in combat. He felt so badly about missing his moment in the war, that for many, many years, he pretended, even with his own family, that he had served abroad. Now, his mother knew better. I don't know exactly why, but I do know that his mother knew that this was a fiction, but she kept up the fiction because she was loyal to her son. His brother John's memoir talks about Faulkner flying Sopwith camels. He never flew any Sopwith camels. he never got beyond Toronto. But he wrote about the war with such vividness in a novel, Soldier's Pay, and in several short stories, that men who had served in the war also thought. There was a writer, Lawrence Stallings, who had lost a leg in the war, who believed that Faulkner, in fact, had served in the war. Tremendous impact on him that he never stopped thinking about. A novel we haven't spoken of that I deal with in my second volume, A Fable, which he was hoped would be his masterpiece, is all about World War I and about a regiment that decides to, in a sense, go on strike, to not fight, and what the generals do when they face these fighting men who have been very courageous, who essentially throw down their arms. So it was, and this was a story really of the unknown soldier, that kind of Christ figure that he first heard about a story that was kicking around in Hollywood that the director Henry Hathaway told him about, and that stuck with him. And he began first writing a screenplay and then eventually a novel, which was published in 1954. So World War I had just a tremendous impact on him.
Yeah. So for our last question, I wanted to ask during these this perilous time, like what is the writing that you have turned to right now? Like, what can you suggest to help you cope?
Well, something new and something old.
Yeah.
The new is this new biography of George Washington, really the first one. There have been some other work by women on Washington, but this is really an interesting book called You Always Remember Your First, about George Washington. Very provocative book. For instance, in describing Mount Vernon and in Washington's attitude towards slaves. And she actually calls Mount Vernon a forced labor camp. It's a very provocative, very interesting account of George Washington. So that's a contemporary book, a book that people are reading and discussing right now. The other thing I've done, now that I'm retired and no longer teaching, there are some biographies that are quite long. Mine's 2 volumes, but Winston Churchill wrote a 4-volume biography of a soldier, Marlborough. And I've gotten so far through 3 volumes. And even though that sounds like a lot, Churchill, won the Nobel Prize. And part of the reasons he won his Nobel Prize was because of his work for literature, for his work in biography. You can't find any other biographers in the English language who've won Nobel Prizes. So there's still a lot to learn from Winston Churchill, not just about the Second World War or even the First World War, but about the 17th and 18th century.
Nice. You're ready to tackle that 4th then?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Pretty soon.
Awesome. Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you so much, Carl, for being here with us, especially within this first week of PMP Live. It's just been fantastic having you. And I'd like to remind you all to please click that button below to purchase The Life of William Faulkner. That takes you directly to the Politics and Prose website. And it's your support, it's buying these books that's going to keep us around. So please do support us and help us out and, purchase Carl's book, And we do have a whole slate of events coming up. We tomorrow at 7 o'clock is David Daly with Unrigged. And as well as at 5 o'clock is Celeste Headley with Do Nothing. So please join us on those. You can also, at the top, right next to the Politics and Prose icon, you see the follow button. You can click that and follow us and look at what we have coming up. We appreciate you being here and supporting us. So please come back and see us on PMP Live and stay well read. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you.
Thank you.